Thank you for joining. I appreciate everyone hopping on the call. It's good to hear from more than just the developers. And we'll just jump right in. Feel free to stop me at any time if you have questions, and I'll try to be as timely as possible. So looking at the agenda for today, we've split it up into three sections. First section will pretty much be fairly high level, talking about ERPI, why we need it, things it can do, the basic architecture. That's geared more toward the sales folks and EMs, and then we'll dive a little bit deeper, look into some of the architecture for the architects and PMs, and then and lastly we'll wrap up at sort of the developer level, looking at a little bit more of the details and the technical aspects of the tool. So getting started right away, what is ERPI? It stands for Enterprise Resource Planning Integrator, and basically at the heart, it's a tool, an ETL tool that connects to the general ledger, and then you can bring information into the different EPM products like planning and S-based. And it also has some options for putting the data back, like for writing the budget back into your GL, and also drill through capability. The one nice thing about it is it's got out-of-the-box capability to connect to those. If you look on the screen, it can connect to all of those GLs and even PeopleSoft human resources data, and it can build for that. So basically, if the customer has got a GL that's one of these listed, ERPI becomes very valuable if they're already doing a planning implementation. So how do we use it, and why is it needed? So basically, we want to leverage this for clients who have needs to pull in actuals data or metadata, so think dimensions, from their GL system into part of the EPM suite, S-based, HFM planning, things like that. The nice thing is it is relatively seamless between the GL and EPM. I say relatively being the key word there. Probably one of the largest pluses of this tool is that you have drill through from S-based or planning back to your source system. So we'll go over what that looks like in more detail, but essentially you could be on a web form in Hyperion Planning, double click on it, and it'll bring you back into PeopleSoft or EBS or some other GL like JD Edwards. And then people can log in and see the additional detail there, journal entries, things like that. Like I mentioned, it has out-of-the-box connectivity to PeopleSoft, EBS, SAP, a lot of different options there. One kind of cool feature is the ability to write back the budget data from planning or S-based. There's some caveats to that, but you could essentially, you have your actuals and your GL, you bring those over into planning, you do your budget, and then you want to push the budget back in your GL so it's available for AP and other folks who don't have planning access. So that's a desirable feature as well. And then lastly, if you don't have a GL that's supported, there are options to connect to just about anything using something called the Open Interface Adapter. So if we look at a picture, I like pictures, and this kind of gives you a graphical representation of how the whole tool fits in. So you can see right here in the middle is this thing called ERPI, and it connects between your data sources over here, like PeopleSoft and EBS and SAP, and it can bring that data or metadata, the dimensions, over into your EPM applications over here. The cool thing is it can connect also through FDM. So we've done a lot of projects recently around FDM and getting data into planning that way. So you can pass the data between ERPI and FDM and then stick it in your EPM application, or you can go directly. ERPI can also connect to EPMA, which is a metadata tool for the EPM suite of tools. So if you want to bring, say, your account dimension from PeopleSoft, you can bring it in directly into EPMA and then transform it into something that looks a little bit more S-based friendly. I want to show you an illustration of how the drill through works. And I'm going to assume here for the moment that we are using ERPI and FDM together. And what this looks like, and hopefully you'll like my little animation, is the first step we'll start over here in planning S-based or HFM, and you drill through back to the FDM detail. So you see this first screen here is an FDM screen. The second one you'll get to is a very detailed screen in FDM where you might see, say, some transaction details, kind of small pictures of what FDM would look like there. So this small screen number 2 represents the data that's imported into FDM. And then if you go from there, you can open up the source system and get back into something like PeopleSoft or EBS. You see a screenshot over here. If you were to cut FDM out of the middle here, you would just go straight from planning through ERPI to the source system. So you would cut out these two steps over here. You essentially go from planning to ERPI to your source. That's how the drill through works. Ruth asked if the drill through is real time. So the FDM data is a snapshot of when you imported it. But then when you jump to PeopleSoft, for example, this is actually PeopleSoft pictured here. This hop here from FDM to the source system, you would go from an FDM page to a PeopleSoft login. So they could log in with their PeopleSoft ID, and then that would bring real-time GL data, just like they would normally see if they're making journal entries or things like that. A lot of people want to know the difference between FDM and ERPI. They do very similar things. Why, and just kind of at a high level, what are the difference between the tools? They're both ETL tools that allow you to connect a GL to an EPM suite, so like Essbase to JD Edwards or something like that. You see, well, each tool has several pros. For example, FDM has got a great user interface, whereas ERPI, the user interface is not as good. FDM is really good at logging errors for when we make mistakes. ERPI is not quite as good. But then, if you look at ERPI, it's really good with drilling to the source system. It takes you right back to EBS, right back to PeopleSoft. Minimizes the amount of clicks for the end user. So a lot of people really like that. FDM, there's a couple more clicks. If we were to look at, if you were to sort of take what are the big positives and big negatives, I think you can see here the positives and negatives I've starred. So all the yellow stars would be significant pluses for the tools, and then the blue stars would be significant negatives. In my mind, FDM is a little bit, gives you a little bit more flexibility, but at the same time, ERPI has out-of-the-box options for connecting to those GLs and allows you to drill back. So it's kind of in some ways, it's a toss-up between the tools, but I think really the best approach, and this is something I'll recommend later, is when you marry the two tools together. When you use ERPI to connect to the GL and then pass the data to FDM. So what you do is you get the benefits of both. You get the excellent user interface of FDM, and then you get the out-of-the-box connectivity of ERPI. And so putting the two together, so getting back to Ruth's question, gives you the sort of the benefits of both tools, and the weaknesses in one tool will be covered by the benefits in the other. Okay, so if we just look at high level, what are the takeaways for the sector? Basically, I would say I would recommend using FDM with ERPI from my experience. FDM does not take very long to implement. ERPI can be relatively quick depending on a couple things, but really FDM has got a really nice user interface and really nice batch options that make it very attractive when used in conjunction with ERPI. Like I mentioned, a big plus for ERPI is that it connects with a bunch of GLs right out of the box. And a lot of folks are already using PeopleSoft, EBS, Fusion, things like that. And so instead of writing a custom script or something custom to go against those GLs, we could just leverage ERPI. And sometimes you come to a situation where the client is limited by the budget, or you know that you're sort of a sales conversation that there's a limited budget, and the client would not be able to afford the license for ERPI and FDM and planning altogether, in which case they then have a choice, and you could choose between ERPI and FDM. And at that point, I would probably say, well, if they're looking for if they have supported GLs, that they've got PeopleSoft 9 or JD Edwards or something like that, then I'd probably lean toward going with ERPI, because that'll get them what they need, out of the box. If they don't necessarily care about drill back, or if they don't have a supported GL, then I'd probably look at going with FDM, since it's, in my mind, a more mature product and a little bit easier to use and is more flexible from the end user perspective. There's actually data mapping in both tools, and in some ways the data mapping in ERPI is, I think, slightly more powerful because you can map cross-dimensionally, whereas in FDM you map per dimension. So in terms of if you level the rest of the playing field, the mapping in ERPI is slightly more powerful. but depending how you set it up, you may not need to do a lot of mapping. If a lot of your accounts, for example, are a one-to-one relationship, then mapping is very simple. The question is, do you have to maintain things here in ERPI and FDM? So a lot of, if you're using both tools, basically what happens is ERPI with ODI becomes your vehicle, and the steering wheel and the radio are FDM. And so what you're using on a daily basis is FDM. You're doing the imports, you're checking your mapping, you're verifying, you're using the batch process in FDM. But underneath all of that, it's using ERPI, which is using ODI for all the connections. So I guess what I'm trying to say is if you use FDM with ERPI, you do a lot of initial development in ERPI, but after that, you should be able to just leave everything as is and do all of your management in FDM. So Sasha had a great question here in the office. She said, basically asking which option, FDM or ERPI, is more expensive, and what does, essentially, if you pay for one, do you have to pay for the other? I'm not 100% sure which one is more expensive. My guess is FDM is probably more expensive because Oracle's done a lot of work on ERPI to get it up to speed. So my guess is if you went with ERPI, they'd probably give you a discount, but you probably would have to pay for both if you bought both. This gets into the sort of the architecture section and a little bit more toward project management. So I wanted to put together a list of questions that we probably would want to ask if we were looking at doing an ERPI project. So I call these the guiding questions, and then in the following slide, we'll look at answering those questions. So probably one of the most important ones from just a technology perspective is what system are we connecting to, and is that directly supported by ERPI? Second one, does the client want to leverage FDM? And this is, I would recommend yes, FDM, assuming the budget has got room and that makes some tactical sense. I would say that FDM is very useful with ERPI. Looking at the metadata, because ERPI can do dimensions as well as data. Do we want to use that portion of the tool? Do they have a solution to manage that metadata? Kind of related to that is, how does the client want to source some of their dimensions for the EPM system? Do they want to bring it in from the GL, or do they want to do a local upload, or do they want to use some of the source? There are scheduling questions mostly around the fact that FDM has a little bit better scheduler than ERPI. Is that how important is the nightly process and scheduling some of those? How complex is that? And that plays a factor. Probably a little bit larger question here is, does the client, I really should have moved number 6 up a little further, is does the client want to drill back to the source system? Typically the folks who buy this tool want it for both bringing actuals in nightly, but also giving a drill back option. And so that one probably should be moved up in terms of importance. So looking at getting the budget back into their GL, is that of any importance to the client? And then do they want to automate that? If so, then they probably should look at getting ERPI. And lastly, on sort of more of the business side, is how many financial or IT folks will administer the tool. And this is a situation where FDM is a little bit more flexible in terms of security than ERPI when it comes to multiple folks logging in and managing data. So if we look at answering some of the questions that I already did as we were talking through, basically if the source system is supported, you want to use ERPI, I'd recommend FDM. If you've got a metadata solution, then potentially you might want to pull in the metadata through ERPI. ERPI can be slow, it's worth noting. So if you've got a lot of data that you're importing, sometimes it's a little faster to bring it into SQL with FDM. And as I mentioned, if you've got multiple users, let's say you have multiple folks on the finance team who want to manage the data, who want to import the data, during the day or at other times, then FDM has better user access and a little more intuitive for things like that. So if we were to look at sort of takeaways at the project manager perspective, one thing I actually really haven't touched on very well is the fact that ERPI leverages the ODI tool as its sort of underlying engine. And so if you were to be on a project that leverages ERPI, you would need someone with ODI experience to participate in the development to set up ERPI. It's an initial setup at the beginning, and after it's set up, it should be, you shouldn't need to maintain it very much at all. But it is worth noting that you'll probably need to give Dimitri a call if you need ODI help. If you're familiar, and then from just a staffing perspective, if you're familiar with FDM, picking up on the ERPI should be relatively simple, provided you have a little bit of ODI support. So if you were brand new to the ETL, relatively brand new to the ETL process, and brand new to ERPI, you can mess around in FDM and pick up some of this stuff and sort of learn the language. Now, getting back to Ruth's question on timeline, let's say, for example, that you have a project like Inflow or Christie's where we have a planning project and then we add FDM. If you wanted to add ERPI to an FDM timeline to leverage both tools together, then I would say you probably need an extra week or two of development time to add the ERPI piece to the FDM timeline. And Ruth asks, if you were just doing ERPI, how long would that take? I would say probably it would depend on the amount of mapping, the amount of data movement, if the client wants to bring in those dimensions from the GL. If you're just doing data only, something very simple mapping, data only, I would say you could probably do it in 4 weeks, 3 weeks maybe, if you have someone who knows what they're doing. If it is more complex, let's say you want to bring dimensions like an account dimension in or things like that, then you're going to want probably close to 6 weeks to build out that process and make sure everything's running fine. If we go back to the architecture page here, basically in each one of these data sources, ERPI is referencing more than one table. It's referencing several tables. So, for example, in Condé Nast, we did PeopleSoft. And in the PeopleSoft side, I think ERPI references somewhere between 20 and 30 tables. Now, most of those tables you would only need read access. So it's just grabbing the data and moving it over into, say, whatever server you have ERPI on, which is probably, for us, going to be SQL Server. But you will need read access to a significant portion of the original database. So think of it as you need a decent amount of read-only access to your ERP system. Now, it gets a little bit more tricky if you want to do the data write back. If you want to push the budget back from planning into your ERP system, you will need write access to at least one table in your ERP system. And that table is generally designed for this kind of a process. So I think a lot of the ERPI issues that we had at Condé Nast were because there's a patching issue that we ran across, and then we also didn't have the right user access. I think part of that was just internal. Their IT team was very unresponsive and unhelpful, which is kind of an internal politics type thing. But assuming you have a user who has read access at a decent level for the database, and then getting everything connected shouldn't be too much trouble. And of course, my estimate of adding of ERPI, taking 1 to 2 weeks to implement would be ideal best case scenario. So now we're going to start getting into the kind of the nitty gritty developer type side. So Mark Cottarelli is over here pumping his fist. He likes this. So anyway, if you are, I know some of you, this is kind of not your world, so feel free to drop off if needed. But I'm sure there's some stuff in here that would be helpful as well. So we'll kind of walk through the user interface, ERPI at a very basic level, and then we'll start talking about some advanced ERPI functions and what they look like, and there'll be plenty of screenshots and pictures. So feel free to stop me at any time. We'll start with the user interface. As you notice here, it's a very simple user interface with links on the left, this little toolbar area, and then whatever you click on the left shows up over here in the big system over on the right. ERPI is really nice because you can access it through Workspace. So up here in this Navigate menu, you can drop that down and get to ERPI. That's a really nice feature of it. I've listed here the overall workflow. So if you were to set up ERPI with and without FDM, this is kind of the process at a high level that you'd go through. I'm not going to go through this here because it would take too long to discuss. But in the future, if you're on an ERPI project or whatnot, feel free to look this over. I will email out the PowerPoint when we are done. The first thing that you have to do when you're building out ERPI is setting up all of the ODI objects. And basically what you need to do in ODI is set up the technology that you're connecting to. So at Condé Nast, we connected to PeopleSoft, which was on an Oracle server, and then we were putting that information into Microsoft SQL Server. So in ODI, we had to create a connection between Oracle and Microsoft SQL, and we did that through some logical and physical schemas and then also a context. So those of you who know ODI, that sounds familiar. Those of you who don't know ODI, don't worry about it. I can catch you up to speed if you're ever there. But basically, there is, once you've built out that stuff, you come in here to ERPI and you have to set up your ODI settings here because it leverages that tool in order to do all the driving. So this is kind of the boring stuff. Because then we get into some of the more interesting stuff, which is actually creating a source system and pulling in some data. So the first thing you do after setting up your ODI process and setting that up in ERPI is you would create your source system. And this is where you specify whether you're connecting to JD Edwards or PeopleSoft or SAP, things like that. And then you also specify your drill down link. So I give you an example here. This is Condé Nast drill through link to their production server. And so this is the link that will be passed whenever you drill back from Hyperion. After you set up your source system, you got to tell ERPI what your target is. In this case, we're going to target a planning cube. You can definitely load the data through FDM or not through FDM. So there's a little selector here where you can choose that option. And then, interestingly enough, ERPI automatically picks up on the fact whether the application is in a classic mode or an EPMA mode. So if you were to bring in metadata, it automatically knows what to do. If you get everything all connected, then what happens is you click on the source accounting entities task on the left, and it brings back a list of, in this case, business units from your source system. So this is kind of your confirmation that everything's connected, that the ODI piece is fully talking to PeopleSoft, that everything was set up fine. So then from here, what you can do is select the business units you want to bring in. So you can see here we selected 4 for Condé Nast. Once you set up your business unit, you then set up your import formats. And your import format is the piece that says, okay, the account dimension on the PeopleSoft side corresponds to my account dimension in the EPM side, in S-Base, in planning, and whatever. And this is where you map any extra dimensions. So, for example, you can see here in this picture a version. Version is something you need in Hyperion planning, but is not something that exists over in PeopleSoft. So in this case, we mapped a blank field to version because we don't have that dimension over there. But something like account, we do have an account field in PeopleSoft, so we map that to the account field in planning. After you create your import format, you create your location, and this concept is a little tricky. A location is kind of like an entity, but not, you don't load a location to an entity in planning. So if you can think of it as it's kind of like a bucket that corresponds to an entity and a certain import format. It's kind of an FDM ERPI concept. Once you get all that set up, then you can create the piece that actually does the magic, and that is your data load rule. And this is where you tell ERPI, I want to connect to PeopleSoft and I want to bring back my actuals, or I want to bring back my budget that's in the system. So down here, there's some drop downs that you can select. All right, I want to pick my ledger group and my ledger. You can select actuals there. And then when you're done setting this up, you can hit this little execute button here, and that is what is going to go to your source system and bring back your data. Once you click anything, you click execute or things like that, it shows up in what's called the process detail screen, and this is where it'll show you what it's doing. So it's kind of hard to see here, but we're importing data for beginning balance and then January down here. So you see import the balance data from ERP for period 1, January 2013, and then we transform the stage it and export it out from there. So this gives you some information on what ERPI is doing, and there's also some logs here, which can be helpful if you have errors. If you wanted to, and this screen talks about some of the configuration that you'll need to do in FDM if you use ERPI and FDM together. And basically what happens is you set up an adapter in FDM to connect with ERPI. So FDM has a source adapter, which is ERPI, and then a target adapter, which is your S-base or planning, or really S-base planning or HFM or some other EPM system. And so basically in FDM, you have to tell it the data load rule from ERPI so that it knows here's what to connect to, and here's the mechanism for connecting and bringing that data across. You have to do a little bit more development in FDM. You have to specify the source adapter in FDM, so you specify the ERPI adapter, and then that way, when you run an import in FDM, FDM goes back to ERPI, says, hey, give me this data, and then ERPI talks to ODI and the data load rule and brings that information back from PeopleSoft. You can, getting into some more advanced features of ERPI, one feature that is kind of neat is you can actually import the data into ERPI without exporting it to the source system. So here's a good example of what the data load screen in ERPI looks like. So you've got your columns here, which correspond to your dimensions, and then you can see your source version and your target version. So you're like think of your PeopleSoft version and your planning version, your PeopleSoft version, your S-base version. You see like a source operating unit, and then once you complete your mapping, then this column here would populate as well. And you can see your amounts for each combination. So if you were to load data, if you were not to use FDM and you were just using ERPI for data, this is the screen you'd be using a lot to look at your data and making sure things are exported and mapping correctly. If we look at some of the pros and cons of some of these advanced features in ERPI, I'll just cover some of these, and feel free to jump in with questions if you have them. But there are some batch options in ERPI, but they're not quite as good as FDM. So one nice feature of sort of marrying FDM and ERPI together is you get a pretty good batch process with FDM. And the batch process allows you to have that nightly process to import the data, say every night at 3 a.m. to fully update your cube with the latest actual, which is really helpful. Let's hear data load rules. ERPI, as mentioned here, drills directly into the source system if you don't use FDM. If you do use FDM, you take the hop like we covered before. So you can go from S-base to FDM to ERPI. Here's a screen on the metadata loads in ERPI, and I put this under the advanced features because it's not something that would normally be used all the time. And so if you look at the metadata, some of the pros is that you can actually pull an accounts dimension or pull a department dimension from your source system, and you can it'll automatically actually, let's say for example at Condé Nast we had planning, we had ERPI, and we had EPMA. So what ERPI did is it connected to PeopleSoft, grabbed the accounts dimension, automatically put it in EPMA, and then from there we could deploy our cube, which had the accounts dimension from PeopleSoft. So you could essentially automate the whole journey of the accounts dimension from PeopleSoft to your cube. You could automate all that using ERPI, which is kind of neat. The downside to that is ERPI itself doesn't have a lot of options for customizing how the metadata comes across. So let's say you only wanted to choose 5 accounts to pull across, or only base level accounts. There's not a whole lot of options there in ERPI to customize this pull. We talked a little bit about this before, but there's a batch process in ERPI, and there's actually a command line client, so like an executable that you can run to call ERPI and to load data and things like that. It's not quite as good as FDM. For example, you can't do any scripting, so you couldn't have an email. In ERPI, there's not a field where you can say, if this fails, then email Gordon and say he's a real dummy for not figuring out how this works. You can't do that. What you'd have to do is build that into some sort of a Windows batch file to say, if the data load failed overnight, then email Gordon and complain. On the other side of things too, any debugging will generally have to happen in ODI, and so if something fails and you're typically logging into ODI or going to the ODI logs to figure out what failed, as opposed to FDM, which has some logs available and logs you can actually email out. So the batch process is there, it works, but it's a little bit limited. I apologize for not having a better screenshot here, but I completely forgot to take a picture of this before the meeting, so I just took a quick one. But basically, the write back feature is nice if you want to get the budget back into your source system, as we talked about. But the big con here is that you need to have write access to one table in your source system. So you need to be able to stick data back into PeopleSoft. And the problem is it's hard to convince IT that you're a good person and your data is good and you're not going to crash one of their servers or blow up the world when you put the budget back into PeopleSoft or EBS or JDF. This is something where if this is something the client wants, you're going to have to be very patient with IT and do a lot of convincing with them to bring them on board with the concept. A little bit about the ODI setup here. If this is the workflow, if you want to set up ODI for ERPI, again, kind of very technical, kind of boring. If you have questions about it, feel free to email me and I'm happy to walk you through it sometime. Also, I wanted to talk through a couple common problems that we saw at Condé Nast. The first one was we had some drill through problems. When I first started drilling through, there were a bunch of, I actually got 3 boxes in a row. So if you imagine I clicked on a drill through link, I got the first box, one right here, then I got this box, and then I got the third box. So obviously something wrong. And as it turned out, the problem was I hadn't specified my data load rule name in FDM. And so that's what generated all these errors that you see here on the screen. So it's really important that if you're building ERPI with FDM, that you make sure you specify your data load rule in ERPI, from ERPI in FDM configuration. I promise that would make a lot more sense when you actually are working with FDM. Another funny, not really funny at the time, but it's funny in hindsight, errors that we found was I was trying to connect ERPI and FDM, and I had 2 dimensions that were switched. Basically, I was somehow bringing version into department and department into version, which was really confusing. And I thought it was a number of things for a while. Finally got on the phone with Oracle support, and they said, oh, this is a bug we know about. We're working on fixing it, but here's the fix. And so I detailed it here for you guys. Basically, you have to go into your FDM/ERPI database and switch 2 values on the column names, or on the data in a couple columns. Not a huge deal if you've used SQL before, but definitely I was scratching my head for about a half a day trying to figure out why department was importing like version. So very, very tricky. So let's talk about some of the takeaways if you are a developer. So if you want to learn ERPI or really ETL in general, I'd probably recommend starting with FDM since it is generally one of the easiest ones I've seen to use. It's got a nice user interface. I think Brian has already covered some of the FDM things in another tech Scrum. So FDM is nice. It's got a lot of flexibility to it, and it's pretty easy to use. And then once you've learned FDM, I would say jumping onto ERPI is an easy next step. The second piece is the real secret to ERPI is the ODI process that lies underneath it. And I could go into more detail, but it's really boring, so I won't. But if you want to learn ERPI, you're going to need to spend some time in ODI. And that ODI is pretty complex. And so I had to have a lot of help from Ferris and Dimitri and Mark Cardarelli to sort of figure that out. But thanks to those guys, I was able to get up to speed and you get this thing working. So if you're in this position, we need to learn a little bit of ODI. Those guys are great. Talk to them, and they can help you out. Third thing, really, is the errors that do appear. So when you do get an error in the ERPI or ODI, the errors are generally pretty accurate, so pay attention to them. They're generally not super cryptic. You might be curious where the error is coming from, but generally they are pretty good. And then I would recommend a healthy knowledge of SQL for working with these tools because they do a lot of SQL in the back end and selecting data, moving it around. So some cool links for follow-up. I know some of you like, for example, watching YouTube videos. So here we go. Here's a YouTube video explaining ERPI. You feel free to explore that later. If you want to see another video, I've got a flash demo of how to set up ERPI and FDM and connect it to PeopleSoft. That flash demo is actually from Oracle, so it's really good. I can send that over to you if you'd like to see it. And then also here are some couple configuration guides of how to set up ODI, ERPI, and FDM all together. Particularly, I will point out this first one, which is from Oracle Support, which has 4 PDFs of how to do it from 0 to 60 for that combination of 3 tools. So really a lot of helpful stuff here if you ever get in a position where you're actually building ERPI. So just a quick review here, just to kind of recap and put it all on the same screen, kind of the takeaways from the presentation today. So at this point, I'd just like to open it up to any questions that anybody has, either here in the office or on the phone. So Sasha asked the question, if we wanted to get an ERPI demo up and running on our server, what would be involved? Do we need an ERP? Do we need a source system to get things moving? To build out all the so the answer is to build out all the ERPI, FDM, and ODI processes? No. But the thing is, you would, if you don't have a source system, you can't bring any data in. What you could do is 2 options. One, you could fake out. You could figure out what tables ERPI is looking at and get like copies of them from somewhere. You'd have to get like an image of somebody's PeopleSoft system or something, for example, which somebody's generally not going to let you have. The other option is you could always set up ERPI to reference a flat file. Sasha then asked, does it work with SQL Server? So the main thing is whatever ERPI can be put on Oracle or it can be put on SQL. So, and it can connect to either or because it's using the ODI engine. So you could in theory have everything on SQL. You can have all on Oracle. You can have it on either or, but just know that whatever server ODI and ERPI are on has to be the same. So your tools essentially all have to be on the same server. They don't need necessarily, the source system doesn't have to be the same server type. All right, and the last question for Sasha is, do you know if it would work with QuickBooks? It would work with QuickBooks if you could get a flat file out of QuickBooks, then potentially you could connect to the flat file. And I know for sure that FDM will connect to a flat file. So if you can get a CSV or some other tab delimited file, then FDM can definitely do that. Actually, most of this PowerPoint, a lot of the screenshots came from Condé Nast because I did not have it set up on our system. I mean, I can definitely take a second pass and see what else we need to gather from them. I have a bunch of documentation how to set this up in ERPI and how to set it up in ODI. So that's definitely something that we could leverage as well. Okay, if no one has any further questions, I think we're running 10 minutes early, which works. So I will give you back 10 minutes of your day. And thank you very much for listening, and thank you for the questions.